We came for salvation. We came for family. We came for all that's good. That's how we'll walk away.
Aloha and welcome to the Layman's Lounge podcast, a ministry of the laymanslounge.com, where we exist to bring everyday theology for everyday life. And we just started a Facebook page called Theology Applied. It's a place for butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, as well as failures, jerks, and know-it-alls. So head on over there. I'm the chief sinner there. And come and discuss the entire domain of natural life and of the individual life: eating, drinking, caring for one's health, dressing, sleeping, the domestic life, marriage, procreation, managing the household, Bible reading and prayer at table, kneeling for morning and evening prayers, and so on. It also includes social life: bantering, joking, visiting, playing, dancing, attending the theater, traveling, relaxing, walking, touring in carriage, and so forth. By the way, that was Herman Bavinck from Reformed Ethics, Volume 2. So we're actually, there's a question associated with that shortly. But anyways, and we could also discuss this interview that we have with the living legend, the medium of glory, Dr. John Bolt. Yes, brother, thank you.
Wow, there's no way that any human being could live up to that kind of an introduction. But yeah, I recognize the quotation immediately. It's in Bavinck's discussion about God's name, and then also later about the name and reputation of our neighbor. So it's really wonderful. He talks about not playing footloose and fast with God's name. And that includes the obvious things like swearing falsely or carelessly and casually. But he also includes in it the way that we use the Bible. He says that the practice of just, Lord, tell me what I need to do, or how, and you just open the Bible and go put your finger down. He says that that's absolutely wrong. My colleague Richard Muller told me that there's actually a term for it. It's called bibliomancy. So it's, sort of a superstitious, fetishistic use of the Bible.
Whoa.
And jocularity about the Bible. I mean, when I first worked on this, I got to tell you, it made me sit up, because I read what Bavinck had written, and he says, making riddles out of the Bible or playing around with biblical texts is kind of a violation of the commandment against the commandment to keep God's name holy. And I may recall we were doing this, who was not only what sport did Joseph play? And it was tennis, because he served in Pharaoh's courts and things like that. We have these as kids, and I thought, maybe he's being too puritanical, but nonetheless, I do think there are ways in which comedians use the Bible that is truly off limits. So, as I said, I recognized your quote.
Yeah, it's so good. I love Bavinck because he talks about those things, and in the context of, I don't know how to say it, adiaphora, sort of things that.
The adiaphora.
Yeah. So we're gonna hit that. I'm really excited because a lot of that stuff is the normal lived lives. I love Bavinck because he's like the scholar's scholar, but also like the everyman scholar. And so super excited for, Dr. Bolt to be with us. As most of you know, He is, amongst others, the editor of the 4 volumes of Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, which are just like required reading at every like Reformed or Baptist or Wesleyan. It's like everyone's reading these. He's the author of Economic Shalom, a Reformed primer on faith, work, and human flourishing, and Bavinck on the Christian life, following Jesus in faithful service, which is a really, really, really just a great book. And then he's the editor of Bavinck's Reformed Ethics, Created, Fallen, and Converted Humanity. That's volume 1 that they brought to life, published in 2019, which was like a Dead Sea Scrolls find. And then the book we're going to discuss today, the upcoming and follow-up to volume 1, volume 2, Reformed Ethics, The Duties of the Christian Life. And I'm just thrilled. And by the way, we're actually giving away a copy of the book. It doesn't come out for a while, but to enter, go to the Theology Applied Facebook page, and you don't have to like follow us or like us. We just want to talk about the lived Christian life. So bring over anything that you hear from this interview, and let's discuss it. So Dr. Bolt, why I have like 87 questions, so we'll see how many we could get through, but why the fresh interest in Bavinck among the academy today, but more so, why your own interest?
Well, my own interest goes back to my time in seminary, when my own teacher, Anthony Hoekema, regularly praised Herman Bavinck. He did his dissertation on Herman Bavinck. And so in my systematic theology classes, Professor Hoekema would make reference to, and he also had translated for us in our eschatology class a section from eschatology in Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics on the wideness of God's mercy, which I thought was a magnificent piece. So I had this kind of interest in Bavinck already in seminary. Then when I was working on my PhD, my thesis advisor wanted me to write a dissertation on Jonathan Edwards, which was his own scholarly interest. I did that for about 3 months. I started and I got overwhelmed. And I got overwhelmed because the language and the tradition of Edwards was not my own. And it was like having to acquire a whole new language. And I thought, the preparation for this is going to take me too long. So in talking to him, he asked me, he says, well, take someone from your own tradition like Bavinck, and he says, start reading some of the secondary literature, and then I'll see you in a couple of months and we'll see if we can come up with an idea. So I did, and that's where I came up with the idea of writing on Bavinck's notion of the imitation of Christ as an ethical ideal. And from then on, Bavinck I knew would be really, really important to me personally. When I started teaching at Calvin Seminary in 1989, we have had always a significant number of Korean Presbyterian students who came to Calvin to do THMs. And then when we added the PhD program, also PhDs. And from the beginning, I would get Korean students who asked me if they could do research on Herman Bavinck. Why? Well, they had had teachers in Korea, many of them whom had studied in the Netherlands and who came back telling their students about how wonderful Herman Bavinck was. And I said, well, yeah, but the Dogmatics is only available in Dutch. They said, okay. So what they started to do, they asked the translator, John Freend, who worked in the library at Calvin, and asked him if he would translate sections, and they paid him for it. So they could get into Bavinck. Some even started studying Dutch. I mean, it was really a remarkable kind of
Yeah.
dedication.
Yeah.
Well, John Freend came to me one time after having done this for a number of students, and also to the president of the seminary, James DeYoung, and said, we should really think about just getting translation project together to do the whole thing. I said, well, I'd be in favor of that, but I knew it was a big project.
Yeah.
But we formed the Dutch Reformed Translation Society from a number of different schools and a number of different Reformed denominations. And we went ahead and we first did the eschatology section, which sold quite well. So Baker said, well, we'll do the whole thing. And then that's how it came about. It took us, we started in 1994, and the final volume, the fourth volume, came out in 2008. So it was about 14 years.
Wow. Yeah. Hey, honestly, sincerely, thank you. A lot of people owe like their own growth and piety to your guys' labors. Thank you so much. And I do want to call attention to another book that you helped translate, which is a modern book called Christian Dogmatics, an introduction, from Cornelius van der Kooi, which is literally, in my opinion, the best modern dogmatics. I mean, it is so good, and I feel like it's a sleeper here in America. So anyways, since a lot of people will listen because everyone loves Bavinck, I just want to call attention to that because that thing's gold. Anyways, how was the from what you've seen, how was the reception of Reformed Ethics Volume 1 versus the reception of the Reformed Dogmatics? And how does Bavinck's ethics fit with his dogmatics?
Okay. The first question about how well is it doing? It's doing very well. I don't have the latest numbers, but it has sold really, really well. And it's received very good reviews. Your second question was, how do they relate to each other?
Yeah.
Well, Bavinck always understood that though the discipline of dogmatic theology or systematic theology is different in its object. I mean, the goal of systematic theology is to explore the full truth about God, about the way of salvation, about God's revelation, about what it is to be a human being, how we are saved, the classic topics of theology, based on both the scriptural, of course, ultimately having to be faithful to scripture, but also incorporating the history of the Christian tradition and the interpretation of scripture. So now ethics really goes the next step with the question then, if we know this about God, if we know this about ourselves, if we know this about the world, how then shall we live? I mean, what are the consequences for the way that we live? If we believe that God is triune, that he is a creator, if we believe that Jesus Christ is incarnate, his atoning death is the basis for our forgiveness, that he brings together through his Holy Spirit a church, how does that now mean we have to live? Obviously, within the church community. That's still sort of more part of ecclesiology. But it's also a question, how do we live in God's world? And they're intimately connected. I mean, you can't do Christian ethics without the foundation of what has already been believed and said by Christians about these topics and about what theologians have done with it. So an anthropology, how do you view the human person, is crucial for Christian ethics. And so what kind of hope do we have in this world?
Mm.
What's the role of God's law? All these things they naturally flow from Christian dogmatics, but their orientation and their goal is different. The question there is in ethics is, how do we now live? What is the conduct? What is the activity that the theology leads us to? But they're not to be separated.
So good. I'm just taking a note. I'm actually taking notes. This is so good. So I'm gonna admit that I was taken back when I read the dedication where you said, I wasn't taken, you said this quote, to Richard John Mao for keeping Christ and the law together. So side note, I'm not taken back with that. It's for Richard Mao. Everyone loves that guy. And we actually just had Matthew Kamick on the show discussing the sort of festschrift in his honor. So anyways,
okay, the public theology thing.
Yeah. So and then you solidify that notion of keeping Christ and law together. You solidify as much in the intro when you said, quote, as Bavinck works out the concrete content of his ethics in this volume, however, he joins the long tradition of Reformed ethicists and turns to the Decalogue and the notion of duty. That move could be disconcerting for some who have recently turned to the, quote, kingdom ethics, end quote, of union with and imitation of Christ, because that emphasis is seen as a counter to the role of law and duty in Christian living, end quote. And then you said, quote, the heart of Bavinck's understanding of the Christian life in volume 1 is found in chapter 9, with its emphasis on union with Christ and the imitation of Christ, end quote. So given those realities, can you speak to this notion of keeping the law and gospel together, if you will, when we so often hear that we need to properly distinguish the law and gospel?
Well, we need to distinguish law and gospel. I mean, it's not only Lutherans who acknowledge that we got to distinguish them, but distinguishing is not separation. You know, when I wrote my dissertation on Bavinck's understanding of the imitation of Christ, and in my dissertation, as well as in my little book on Bavinck, I point out that for the Christian, our union with Christ is the heart of who we are, our identity, what makes us what we are as human beings now redeemed in Christ. But strictly speaking, the imitation of Christ cannot be for us a comprehensive ethic. It's both a passive ethic and also a negative one. And if you take some of the best contemporary full imitation ethicists like John Howard Yoder, it means saying no to power, saying no to war, and so forth. But in spite of, I would say, and I want to say this carefully, I don't want to offend anybody, but in spite of the "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets, of which I have one myself, what would Jesus do is not a comprehensive ethic. It can't be. For one thing, Jesus did not get married.
Yeah.
So you can't imitate Jesus in his life of being a single person. I mean, if you're going to be a single person, and that is your calling and vocation, taking what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 and so forth into account, fine. But Jesus cannot be this. So ask yourself the question, well, how do we talk about even Jesus in terms of having to imitate him? Well, the answer is Jesus was obedient to his Father's will. And that means for us to know how to do the Father's will means that we've got to ask questions about the law. So,
Yeah.
I understand the worries about legalism and moralism and all of that, sure. And Bavinck is Bavinck, is cautious about those. He even calls attention to those things.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to ask, what is the guide for our life and how we live in the world? Neither saying, well, we have to be citizens of the kingdom or we have to follow Jesus in a life of imitating his life is a sufficient or comprehensive. It's the spirit, it's the means or the way in which we fulfill obedience to the law.
Okay.
But and that's why, look, Rich Mao deserves to have this volume dedicated to him for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
But as I was writing the introduction, and we had talked about this as a team, and we realized that there was going to be, because I've been at conferences in which we've discussed Bavinck's ethics, and there are those who felt that there was a tension between what he says in volume 1, which they loved, and then he returns and they sigh and they moan. They say, he returns back to duty and the law. This is our contemporary world of Christian ethics. And so, look, I'm not adverse on occasion to being a little cheeky and to tweaking people's noses, but that is a kind of, that's a little bit of nose tweaking against those who want to divide law from union with Christ. And one of the things that Rich Mao did in his book on divine command is to make it very clear to us that law did not mean legalism, and that to throw over the law, you got into trouble. And so I'm delighted that we're honoring him. He deserves it.
Absolutely.
With this dedication.
I want to make sure you listeners heard this line that from Dr. Bolt. Distinguishing law and gospel is not separating them. Selah. Okay. In connection with this subject, this line in the intro, quote, these duties are not external to us. They are not arbitrarily imposed divine commands. They accord with our created nature, end quote. So what way are his ethics trinitarian and have a starting point in creation and sort of the created nature?
Well, I picked up those 3 features. First of all, because if you take the imitation of Christ or the kingdom as your sort of ethical unifying theme and set it over against law, you really are setting the work of the Son over against creation. So you have a kind of division in the work of the persons of the Trinity, which I think is a problem. So that's why you keep them together. Having a full orb Trinitarian understanding of God and of the relationship between creation and redemption means that you keep them together. And I also use the word covenantal because I understand the issues with legalism. I mean, I understand that, legalism is the reformed temptation. It's the reformed, if Bonhoeffer's right that cheap grace is the danger in the Lutheran tradition because it's all gospel over against law, the Reformed tradition does have a problem in, I would say, mostly in Reformed folk piety, of
Yeah.
being moralistic, of being legalistic. And we got to be aware of that. But then that doesn't mean that you then say, therefore, we were not going to talk about the 10 Commandments, because it ignores, of course, the fact that the 10 Commandments are covenantally framed. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's why. I mean, it's the covenant with Israel. You know, it's really interesting. This morning, I read an article about in which somebody was criticizing dispensational theology because it had two tracks of salvation, two different ways of salvation.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting to me, and I've read dispensationals, but it never hit me as hard as it did this morning when I was reading this, that, okay, there's the dispensation of promise to Abraham, and the children of Abraham failed that test in dispensational thinking. So then they get the dispensation of the law. But the way that some dispensational writers posed this, it was like the law at Sinai was kind of a sad development. You know, it's regrettable.
Wow.
And that is exactly why, I mean, I hadn't thought of that when I wrote the introduction, but that's why the emphasis upon it being covenantal.
Wow.
And then the metaphysical.
Yeah.
The law of God accords with our nature. Human societies that allow stealing and murder and celebrate promiscuity and deceitfulness and lying and covetous greed are not societies that are going to flourish.
Yeah.
Because those are activities that really go counter to our nature as image bearers of God and as people who are by nature social. We live with other people. So these commandments aren't like arbitrary dictates from some tyrant who says, I don't want you to have any fun, you know?
Right.
I mean, it amazes me that sometimes even Christians who ought to know better will accept this kind of a characterization from the H.L. Menckens of this world, that, you know, somewhere there's a Puritan who's looking out for somebody who's having fun and wants to stop it.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's Trinitarian, it's covenantal, and it's real. I mean, there's nothing that's artificial or imposed upon us. It's in full accord with who we are.
Okay, Dr. Bolt, you get my blood pumping. He's hitting us. Folk reformed piety. I know what you're saying there. And then did you guys catch this one? The law of God accords with our own nature, which obviously we'll drill down, discuss more. But can you give like perhaps a concrete example, either that Bavinck uses or you yourself could think of, as far as sort of framing duty and law in creation? Like maybe an example of just even like a busy mom or a dad just living his Christian life.
Well,
rather than it being like a top-down imposed thing, in what ways is are the right choices a part of creation or whatever?
Okay, well, let's take the obvious one. The fourth commandment about the Sabbath is very relevant for extremely busy working mothers. You know, my wife used to say that, you know, when she was growing up, I mean, the women were busy. She's one of 4 children, and her dad was a farmer, and they worked on the farm in the summertime, and she was busy doing that too. But then on Sundays, it was up to the women to make huge Sunday dinners. Well, and again, as I said, my cheeky side says, excuse me, doesn't mom get a Sabbath, right? So to me, that is an immediate practical consequence of saying the Sabbath. Now, in the Reformed tradition, there's all kinds of wonderful discussion, and Bavinck gets into that in his chapter on the fourth commandment, which is interestingly the longest chapter on the commandments. I mean, he discusses all the commandments in volume 2, but the longest chapter is on the Sabbath, which is fascinating. And
Right.
what I love is he gets into history, and he goes into the Jewish tradition. I mean, it's fabulous. But the issue about rest is that it isn't only about, I mean, ultimately, says Bavinck, we take days of rest because God commanded it, but God commanded it for our good. And because we are also people who need to pull aside and worship. So worshiping God is an essential part of the Sabbath command. But the Reformed tradition, in its reflection on the Sunday or the Sabbath, also recognized that there were goods, moral goods, that attended the Sabbath. I mean, Calvin, in his discussion of the Sabbath, talks about the importance of giving servants rest. And then, that ties in with the whole Old Testament understanding of who Israel is and getting rest from slavery. So it's all tied together. I'm talking too much, but that,
No,
it seems
sir.
to me, is one very practical example of how the commandments of God, in this case, the Sabbath command, fit with our nature, and also with recognition of our fallen nature. If we were super strong people who didn't need rest, but not only are we finite creatures who need rest, but we're also fallen creatures for whom our work and our toil can sometimes overwhelm us.
Yeah.
It's grace.
Oh, come on. The first page of the actual book, when Bavinck starts, he says, quote, "The proper ethical question to be posed to the Holy Scriptures is not what is our duty, but what is the relation of believers to the law." Where does he take that sort of further nuance it?
Well, the relational dimension of it is, of course, covenantal. He doesn't want a discussion of duty in a kind of abstract sense. I mean, one of the things that Bavinck does, and one of the reasons why I think that even though the Dogmatics is now more than 100 years old, and these lectures are, the same age, what Bavinck does is he also engages modern thinkers. And the modern duty philosopher is, of course, Immanuel Kant. But Bavinck has many places where he talks about Kant in really helpful ways. For one thing, Kant's duty is very cold and very abstract. It's not, and loveless and graceless. There's no forgiveness. So duty is not just, Buck Private, having just gone through boot camp, listening to a screaming sergeant and doing what he's told to do. It's not bare naked duty.
Mm-hmm.
It's a duty that comes in a relationship. First of all, in a relationship to God, but then also in relationship to others.
Mm-hmm.
So the material in the second half of the book, where after he talks about the first command, 4 commandments, then he goes into the neighbor. Our duties towards our neighbor and also towards ourselves. He talks in a very, I think this is unique. I've not read this in any other ethics book, modern one that, he borrows from 19th century sources like Rothy and Martinson and others, but I've never come across anyone who talked about this duty to self in terms of a relationship. I mean, we also have to have the capacity, as in a certain sense, to think of ourselves in the third person as an image bearer of God when we think about our health, when we think about bodily care. It's always a relationship that is rooted in our relationship to God. We do not think about our neighbor as simply a sort of an object of duty. We think about our neighbor as a fellow image bearer of God. And that's why this relational thing is so important right at the beginning. Excuse me.
No, it's good. So Bavinck said, quote, "At bottom, religion is a duty, but also a privilege. It's not work by which we bring advantage to God or make a contribution to him and have a right to reward," and so on. And then another place, he says, in regards to the notion, like when Christians begin to force themselves to obey Christ, which I often do that. He says, quote, "Often they must still force themselves to obey Christ. They often still have to summon the imperative of duty to help them because they're not always inclined to perform their duty. But this use of the law becomes and must become more and more superfluous." So having said all that, what is our motivation for good works? Is it gratitude or simply part of the way we're created to be? Or is should it be a natural impulse and we're just uncovering it? Or
for the Christian, it's gratitude. Gratitude in a very full sense, because it's gratitude that arises from knowing who we are as God's image bearers and knowing who we are as those who have been redeemed by Christ. So that the question about, well, yeah, the last option you gave was, well, this is how it ought to be. This is what we were created for. But it's knowing what we were created for that comes out of a very rich knowledge, which includes a really heightened awareness of our being redeemed.
So what if our heightened awareness isn't that heightened? It's like we sort of know in theory, but it's, you're grateful in theory, but at the end of the day, you're like I probably love my kids more than I love God right now, but I want to love, and I know that in Christ I do, if you will, because of my union. But what is our way forward here?
Well, Bavinck doesn't get into that so much, although the quote that you read a while ago um, the fact that being obedient is still the right thing to do, even if you don't feel all that much like it.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me, by the way, that's exactly why those who want to downplay duty have, maybe they have a romantic anthropology of some sort, because, yeah, right. It's true. We ought to just want to do what God asks of us, and especially for Christians.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have so much more than just, rules and regulations about how we ought to live. And yet, when we fall short, um, there's a certain kind of what I would call elitist notion of Christian ethics that says, or that gives the impression that if your motivations and your intentions and your desires aren't the highest, then just doing something because it's the right thing to do is of morally inferior and of less significance.
Yeah. That's a lot of people.
The quote that you read, I think, from Bavinck, shows his disagreement with that.
Mm-hmm. So, like, continuing on this theme of like the fuel for our good works, right, if you will, this, this gratitude, if he was writing today in 2021, would the chapter be called "Fake It Until You Make It," sort of like living into that reality? But I mean, at the end of the day, we have escaped condemnation, so we're not going to get busted by God because Jesus got busted in our stead. And so, and if you don't have a belief of rewards, should we then start really thinking, okay, there's some true reward? Like, what is the fuel to literally hold my tongue when my tongue just wants to start the fire? I often like it to this, Dr. Bolt. This is actually pretty disgusting. But when you got to go pee and you hold your pee, and it's better if you hold it and then go in the bathroom. But if you were instantly to just pee your pants, it actually is quite pleasant at the moment because it's real warm and you're no longer having to deal with the pain of holding a bladder. But then it's like, ugh, this is sticky and stinky and everyone's judging me. So I'm not sure if you could use that example, but at the end of the day, I want to be an ethical man, and I don't have that much gratitude enough to take me to that place.
Okay. Yeah, I think that analogy is probably homiletically out of bounds.
All right.
I mean, I'm trying to think what I could say on the pulpit. I don't think I would say that. But yeah, I think that here again, what I said earlier about gratitude being quite broad and comprehensive, it's true that we don't want to place upon people the kind of, well, if you don't do what's right, God will condemn you. Not if we take seriously our redemption in Christ. But we can, I think, it seems to me, talk about ways in which we dishonor God. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I don't think we ought to rule out all dimensions of thinking, not thinking negatively about God, but thinking about our relationship to God in negative ways when we fail to honor him. And that's why maybe just talking about gratitude is inadequate as a motivator. I mean, and you know, I don't think there is one sort of silver bullet motivator for the Christian life.
Good.
I'm now, you know, sort of trying to think in Bavinckian terms, because he doesn't quite deal with this directly, but
because Dr. Ball, I'll say this, like, I agree with guilt, grace, gratitude. And I even agree with the chief end, or I don't actually agree, but like if we were to say the chief end man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, I see all those things, but those don't resonate with me. But what does resonate with me, you know, but I'm really am just a layman or whatever, trying to make it through this world, is this notion of ethics and right choices rooted in just true humanity and flourishing. And I don't know why I always return to this one. I always return to this idea of he is our God and we are his people. For some reason, I don't know why, but that motivates me, but I haven't been able to put it to words. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think you're on the right track. And right now, I'm not thinking of a sort of a neat way of being able to capture that. As I said, I don't think there is a silver bullet.
Sure.
You know, listen, what people need to motivate themselves or be motivated to live a full Christian life, to be loving and so on, I think probably varies from person to person. You know, well, here's an example. I think that what stops a lot of people from doing harmful and wrong things is stopping and coming to an awareness that this would be devastatingly hurtful to someone that they love dearly. I think obviously that should work in marriage, but also parents and children, both ways.
Yeah.
And so the notion that if there are certain kinds of conduct that would be really dishonoring to God, I think works as a motivator for some people. It might not for others.
Oh man, that was a really good response. Thank you. A little bit of pastoring coming out. I receive it. Hey, you know, keeping your sort of Bavinckian, you know, worldview or, you know, thought process in, what do you think he might say to a question like this? What is more holy, Dr. Bavinck, the Lord's Supper or supper with my family, praying or taking a nap, talking about Jesus or talking to my wife about a rough day at work, or going left on my walk to the ocean or going right on my walk to the mountains?
Well, some of those are of a different order than others. Mountains or ocean. By the way, you know, if you read that section on adiaphora,
yep,
Bavinck says that that's a really tricky question.
Yeah.
Because there are circumstances in which choices we make may in the abstract seem like they're neutral.
Yeah.
In actual fact, for me at this point in my life, in these circumstances, the path is very clear. A good example of that is when someone is placed in a situation about what to do with their calling and their vocation. And, well, you know, clearly choosing to be a medical doctor or choosing to be a missionary are not at an abstract level. They are not moral choices that you say one is morally right and one is morally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But if your motivation for being a medical doctor is you know that you'll have a much more comfortable life, make a lot more money being a medical doctor than being a missionary to Egypt, and you have been wrestling with the Lord for some time now about this sense of urgency that you have about the Christian church in Egypt, then it does become a moral decision. And see, that's the way Bavinck treats this. Even things that may, on the face of it, seem like they're equivalent or there's no right or wrong attached to one, in a specific circumstance in a particular person's life, may in fact become wrong. And this is not a matter of, well, it's all up to the individual. He's very clear that this does not mean that all moral decisions are all pure, neutral individual choices. But it does mean that each person has to wrestle with the morality of specific acts, which may, in fact, on the face of it, seem to be indifferent.
Yeah, I mean, I really love that section where Bavinck on the, I still don't know how to say it,
adiaphora. Yeah.
Adiaphora, you know, I'm really stirred by that, you know, when he says, quote, "This realm includes the entire domain of natural life and of the individual life." And then he talks about eating, drinking. He talks about like something like wearing a hat with a, you know, a crease in it or not, you know, kneeling.
Yeah.
I love all that stuff.
See, now this is another thing about Bavinck that I think is hard for people to swallow today, but fits into his strongly what I would call Christian historical imagination. He says, look, exactly what vestments clergy wear. It isn't that one's morally right and one's morally wrong, but when you are in a particular context, to go and egregiously flaunt your own desires over against what is been expected in a congregation. I mean, you know, if a congregation is used to its pastor, minister preaching in a Genevan gown, and you say, well, that's just sort of papist formalism, and you go up there in cargo pants and sneakers the first time you're leading worship, that is, and I would have no trouble saying, I think that is sinful and morally wrong. Because it is not that, you know, necessarily what you're wearing is evil, but it is in that circumstance and in that situation. And he handles all that, I think, in such a balanced, nuanced, and careful way. You know, for someone who puts all that emphasis upon law and duty. Bavinck is not a legalist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, in the last sentence in his chapter on the Sabbath, you remember that? What he says there? He says, no Jewish strictness. I mean, he doesn't want this sort of casuistry and nitpicking about details. I'm sorry here.
No. So we're hitting, as we're on the subject of, let's just use the terms command or law and gospel or command or whatever. And in this realm of forensic pleasure of God and maybe the fatherly pleasure of God for a Christian. So if you were to say, Dr. Bolt, since your life is hidden in Christ, the full pleasure of God rests on you because it's not you live, who Christ in you. And so you might say, Dr. Bolt is my son with whom I'm well pleased, even in the midst of, so anyways, that's sort of that forensic announcement. Is there something to be said of, I don't know if Bavinck has a term for this, but maybe something like a fatherly pleasure of God, where we see, in fact, we actually can further please God, or we can, in fact, grieve God. How do those work together?
Yeah, I don't recall, and I don't think that Bavinck pursues that. No, not even in the discussion on the first and second and third commandments.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about dishonoring God.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to lie. It's a real question for me in my own life, because I used to wake up when I commingled the law and gospel and think, all right, I need to read my Bible today and evangelize. And then it'll increase my standing before God. I never thought I was going to lose it, but I was essentially, Roman Catholic. But then when I realized I am a son with whom he's well pleased, I began to rest and work from an overflow. But then as I start reading the Bible and taking it serious, I see, in fact, it's like, figure out how you may please God, or such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So it almost puts me on this hamster wheel again. I was just hoping you could fix my life up there.
Okay. Well,
can you fix my theology, please?
He does deal with the issue of works meriting something.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't have all 500 pages memorized, but as I recall, he deals with, in the section where he deals with relics and with counsels of, also with counsels of perfection.
Mm.
The idea that somehow or other there are works that are really, really good works in merit. That'd be the section I would send you to, I think, to look at.
Okay. Was that counsels of merit? Is that what you said?
Counsels of perfection. It's in the chapter on duties. Okay. And particularly the classification of duties.
Well, thank you. As always, I have like 15 other questions, so I'm just gonna have to choose my last one. Let's go with this. I'll give you a choice. You could hit either one of these. Question one you could hit is, if I were to say, hey, Dr. Bavinck, I'm about to start my day today and I want to be an ethical man, what's the one liner I should return to, or what's a guiding principle? So you could either respond to that question, or you could respond to the question of like, is this an important book for pastors and just normal Christians to get and read? Will it will it really help us to like live this life? And because we want to honor God and we want to be good men and women, Coram Deo.
Yeah.
Which one are you going to do?
Well, I'm going to do the second one because, and I'm going to tie it also to the first volume.
Oh, okay.
Because I think what Bavinck does in the first volume, in his discussion of conscience, for example, and in dealing with the ways in which the Christian life gets derailed, and he provides some of them very traditional, but then he also includes in there things like vigils and prayer and fasting. But he's got a whole he deals with what we've given the title spiritual pathologies and the cures to it. So he's in the first volume, he's taken on the role of a pastor and pastoral application of the pitfalls, the challenges, the temptations in the Christian life, and what to do about them. Then, in the second volume, his treatment of the Ten Commandments goes deep into them. That is to say, he explores what really gives them their heartbeat. And he does that in the context of the whole history of Christian thought, but also of pagan thought. I mean, he contrasts a Christian understanding of duty with that of the Stoics, with that of Kant and the like. And when he gets into how do we look at life, he has a whole section on suicide and the romantic cult of suicide in the 19th century among the German romantics. Now, that kind of stuff, I think it might be heavy going for someone who's not theologically trained to go through this, but I think it is essential reading for pastors. How do you deal with the question of perseverance in the faith? He explores what people like Perkins and Aim. I mean, so I think both volumes are a gold mine for pastors, both for preaching and for their pastoral work. On occasion, it could even be used as a reference book, but I think the right way to use that material, like in the first volume, go through the imitation of Christ, go through the section on spiritual pathologies and then the cure, savor them. You will never run out, I think, of stuff for sermons or for application in pastoral care. Yeah, we got new problems. Bavinck didn't know about nuclear weapons and AIDS and, COVID-19, but human nature doesn't change. And I mean, I don't know if you caught this. In the section on self-preservation, I mean, he doesn't like what some people have done with the twofold commandments. And well, we must also love ourselves. He thinks that that's a mistaken way of thinking about it. But we do have an obligation for self-preservation. And he picks up two examples that have been much debated. What do you do as a Christian when you're persecuted? Tertullian says you're not allowed to escape persecution. You just take it, be a martyr. Bavinck sides with Augustine and says no. But here's the interesting one. fleeing from plagues. Is it permissible to flee from plagues? Or do you have an obligation to stay? Bavinck says, no, you could perfectly fine to flee, but maybe not for pastors. Now,
Wow.
here's somebody writing who gave these lectures at the end of the 19th century. And you want to talk about human nature not having changed? Even the problems that we face not having changed. We still wrestle with some of these same kinds of issues. Self-preservation. How much do you love your neighbor? You know, I mean, that hasn't changed.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Dr. John Bolt, a brother. Wow. Thank you. Thank your wife for letting you do this, all these.
Listen, thank you for asking me. I mean, you know, you can probably tell I'm not entirely dispassionate about Bavinck or about the material in the book. I mean, it does live for me, and I'm happy to be able to have a chance to do some propagandizing for it. Thank you for asking.
Absolutely. The book's Reformed Ethics, The Duties of the Christian Life, Volume 2. That's on Baker. Like I said, we'll be giving away a copy, so go to the Theology Applied Facebook page. Let's chat some of this stuff. Dr. Bolt, I hope you have a most glorious Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, and the same to you.
We came for salvation. We came for family. We came for all that's good. That's how we'll walk away. We came to break the bad. We came to cheer the sad. We came to